World press freedom has fallen to a 25-year low. That's according to Reporters Without Borders' 2026 index. For the first time ever, more than half of the world's countries are now classified as having difficult or very serious conditions for journalists. Even Taiwan, a relative bright spot, dropped from 24th to 28th out of 180 territories and countries. So is this a global downward spiral, or is there still reason for hope? Joining us now for a closer look at the report and what it means for journalists in 2026 is the director of Reporters Without Borders Asia Pacific Bureau, Cédric Alviani. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Andrew.
So the latest RSF report paints a very dark picture of the global situation for journalists. What's the biggest driver in the decline this year?
Yes, it's never been worse. The decline comes mostly from the fact that platforms are sucking a lot of revenue that media outlets used to receive in the past, and without which it's more and more difficult for them to operate. In a time of war, the attitude of governments has changed, and now journalists have become targets of snipers and of drones. We see this in Ukraine, we see this in Gaza. Authoritarian regimes have never been so numerous and so active in repressing the media outlets. And in more and more countries in the world, it is just impossible to independently report the news. And even in democracies, there is a wave of lawsuits that make it harder and harder for journalists to do their work on a daily basis.
Now, when you're talking about platforms, you're talking about social media platforms mostly, or is it, what kinds of platforms?
Yeah, social media platforms that have somehow replaced the networks of distribution of newspapers and which now are the ones that collect the revenue and in most of the cases do not redistribute the revenue to those who actually do produce the news, which makes actually this giant economic crisis the first cause of distress for media outlets and media companies in the world.
Can you tell me a little bit about how the World Press Freedom Index is created? What sorts of things does RSF look at?
We circulate a survey to a growing number of respondents. We now have, I believe, nearly 10,000 respondents in the world who are media experts. We ask them to assess the social context, the legal context, the economic context, and of course the context of potential violence against journalists. But it's important to say that violence against journalists only does not define the level of press freedom in a country. Actually, in the most authoritarian countries on earth, you can take the example of North Korea, but unfortunately even China now goes in this direction. It is just impossible for journalists to independently report the news. There is no need to kill them or even no need to put them in jail because the whole system is rigged in a way that they just cannot report and have this report communicated to the public.
So Taiwan continues to be a relatively bright spot for press freedom in the region. What's working well here in Taiwan?
Yeah, Taiwan is a democracy. It's a country that is respectful of human rights and the rule of law. And when it goes to press freedom, there is quite a strong respect of the right of the media outlets to do their work.
And so I saw that Taiwan dropped from 24th to 28th in the rankings this year. Is there a specific reason for that drop?
It comes mostly from a drop of the social and legal indicators. And I believe this is somehow related to the lack of trust of the public in the media. You know that according to Reuters Institute, 7 Taiwanese adults out of 10 do not trust the media. This is a major threat for the Taiwanese democracy because in case of a crisis, I wonder how they would find reliable information, which type of sources they would refer to.
Obviously, TaiwanPlus is public media. We pride ourselves in trying to be balanced and unbiased. But it's a big concern for us if 7 out of 10 adults in Taiwan don't trust the media.
There is still a misunderstanding in Taiwan, probably coming from, the authoritarian past of the island. There was a time when Taiwan had state media. State media were media outlets controlled by the state. They were imparting the regime's narrative that was very clear, and the public was quite entitled not to trust them because, of course, they were engaging in propaganda. But now the times have changed. Taiwan is democracy, and the Taiwanese public media are not state media. It's something that the public has to understand. The role of public media is to belong to the public and to be more reliable, because public media do not depend on the market economy. They are media outlets that are supposed to provide more independent information and to be a source of information in case of a crisis, of a disaster. So actually, I believe it is a major mistake that Taiwan would reduce the fundings to public media outlets. They should instead be making their fundings more steady, so that the public can be better served when it goes to information.
Now, there were 4 countries that passed Taiwan or did better than Taiwan this year in the rankings. What can Taiwan learn from these countries?
First, strengthen the journalists' editorial independence, meaning that there should be a regulation preventing the boardrooms or advertising departments from telling reporters what they have to write and what they should not write. This is the first thing. Second thing, the National Communications Commission should be competent for any kind of media outlet and should be actually as harsh with the green media or blue media as it has been in the past with the pro-China media outlets, which are actually the only ones that in the past have been sanctioned for breaching journalism ethics. The third point is, of course, a stronger support to the public media, which is capital for the public to be properly informed. And the fourth point, which actually may be the first in terms of importance, would be to force the internet platforms, Facebook, Google, and others, to pay part of their revenue to the media outlets that actually create information, because without this, media outlets are ailing and they are going to disappear. And the last, fifth measure would be to provide support to the independent media outlets that make the effort of being transparent and open to the public.
Now, I think it's very interesting that Reporters Without Borders Asia Pacific Bureau is located here in Taiwan. I'm guessing that's partially because Taiwan has a relatively free environment, but it also gives you perspective on our near neighbors like China, which is obviously a concern, Hong Kong. Just for an example, Hong Kong was ranked 140th this year, China 178th out of 180 countries and territories. Now, I understand that there are concerns also that the gap between Hong Kong and China is shrinking too.
Unfortunately, yes, China is slowly digesting Hong Kong. We saw this actually when Hong Kong reporters tried to report on this massive fire in Hong Kong towers in the Taipo area of Hong Kong. It was extremely difficult for journalists to report on it because the authorities were not transparent. They didn't want them to access proper sources. There have been, of course, the trial of Jimmy Lai that was
the
totally
Apple
rigged.
media mogul, yeah.
Yes, that was totally rigged from day one till the end. We have exposed the fact that last year some French journalist team going to Hong Kong for reporting were actually under a lot of pressure. One journalist was rejected at the airport, other journalists were being followed. This is absolutely unacceptable.
With this very dire picture that we're seeing in the RSF 2026 World Press Freedom Index, I mean, are you an optimist? I know that you've been working for them for 9 years now. How do you continue to do your work?
Well, when you work for an NGO, you have to be an optimist because no matter the situation, you're acting and you're doing something that in the future will be beneficial for the people. But of course, over the past 10 years, and this is partly the action of Xi Jinping in China and Vladimir Putin in Russia, but the whole situation in the world in terms of press freedom has collapsed, and in terms of human rights in general. So yes, it's very difficult. Yes, we have the feeling that every day the situation is worse. More and more journalists are being killed. Over the past 2 decades, we are close to 2,000 journalists being killed while reporting. China is the world's largest jailer of journalists. So it's more and more difficult to report to the public. Disinformation is reaching heights that have never been seen before. There is deepfake that makes it harder and harder to make the difference between a legitimate, video and an animation. So the situation is worse and worse. And we are very worried that the example of China and Russia would be contagious, and that more and more authoritarian countries would actually copy their regulations that prevent the working of a free press. We are more and more concerned that they would export their equipment, allowing for more surveillance on journalists. And even in democracies, you sometimes hear politicians who are repeating some sentences from authoritarian countries when it goes to journalists who are questioning the legitimacy of journalists who interview them, and this is a worrying trend.
Now, considering Taiwan is, as I mentioned, a relatively bright spot in the region for world press freedom, and indeed in the world, is there some kind of role that Taiwan can play that would help other countries?
Absolutely. That's the reason why we chose Taiwan as a place to set up our regional bureau, because we believe Taiwan, being a democracy, being a country respectful of human rights, Taiwan is actually one country where things can change. And it's about time for Taiwanese not to be shy about their achievements, and also not to be shy about what they could do. It's not because in the past decades nobody has done anything to regulate the media sector that it has to remain that way. It's absolutely possible to improve things, and I believe with little effort, Taiwan would be able first to fix this major flaw to its democracy system, because the major threat to the Taiwanese democracy comes from the weakness of its media environment, but also Taiwan could be able to set itself as an example. And when I say an exemplar, is not only for Asia, but actually a global exemplar, because there's less and less countries respecting press freedom by the rule. And I believe Taiwan is able, within the coming decades, to actually become an exemplar to the world if there is sufficient political will.
Well, I have to say I'm very grateful for your optimism, even in the face of such dark times. We've been talking with the head of Reporters Without Borders Asia Pacific Bureau, Cédric Alviani. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Andrew.
Now you can watch more interviews from the Correspondents series at TaiwanPlus.com or on the TaiwanPlus News YouTube channel. I'm Andrew Ryan. We'll see you next time.